Now, the next section in your course is called Awareness of Discrimination Against Men. And you mentioned what we talked about briefly, suffrage in the UK voting rights. Well, we talked about voting rights in the US, but what were the UK voting rights? What was that content about?
Well, women were really never prohibited from voting in the UK. The same was true in the US. They were just simply limitations that affected women. So in the UK, during the World War I, they limited the number of women who could vote. Okay, somehow that got blown out of proportion because there were so many men away at the war that they said, well, only a certain number of women could vote. They got blown into the idea that, well, men had oppressed women and denied them the right to vote. The right to vote in both the United States and the UK was never tied to gender. It was tied to property ownership and class. And actually, in the United States, women were given the vote immediately in all of the territories. It was only the original 13 colonies that had a limitation on women to vote, because the limitation was one vote per family. And was just, the man would exercise the vote. If he was away at war, if he died, the woman actually had the right to exercise the vote for the family. So the idea that women were deprived of the essential human right of voting is just not true. It's an exaggeration. And we look at how men aren't able to vote unless they apply for the draft. That's a far more serious, life-threatening limitation on the right to vote than anything women in history had ever encountered. So that's how we get a course that is helpful in pointing out this awareness that men are actually more discriminated against than women.
Well, one of the things I think that gets glossed over a lot is when you talk about the suffragette movement. It was the late 19th century, early 20th century when women got the right to vote. What a lot of people make the assumption of is that all men had the right to vote, and your point was that not all men had the right to vote. If you had property, you had the right to vote. If there were 5 men living in a house, only the man who owned that house could vote. The other 4 could not vote. If you didn't own property, you could not vote. So just being a man alone did not give you the right to vote.
Very few of the men who ever fought in wars had the right to vote in the United States or the United Kingdom or most Western countries. So it's a fairy tale that women were heavily oppressed. They weren't. Their justification for hating on men and demonizing men is that they were oppressed by denial of rights like that. It's just not true.
Now, the last section in your course is called Taking the Red Pill. Now, a lot of us know what that means. Some people who hear that phrase think about the movie The Matrix, and that's kind of where the concept comes from, where the blue pill, you can take the blue pill, you can go back to living the life you're living before and sleeping and then living that dream, or you can take the red pill and you can learn the truth. But the thing is this, once you take the red pill, there's no going back. You can't unsee what you've just seen. So I know that in the men's rights movement, the red pill phraseology is used in very much the same way. The topics we're talking about, you don't hear on CNN and NBC and Fox News and all these other channels, these other sorts of media. But when you do hear it, and then you do pay attention to watching things on TV, like, how we talk about men on TV, you begin to say, you know what, that's true. I never noticed that before. It's one of those things that you can't unsee now. What are some of the disadvantages faced by men and boys? And we talked about men mostly, but what are some of the disadvantages faced by boys?
Well, I'm currently writing a book on male suicide, so this example jumps to mind. I've seen headlines in the New York Times and the other mainstream media publications emphasizing that there's been a jump in the suicide of girls in our culture by 20%, something like that. That's outrageous to point that out in a news story without pointing out that boys are committing suicide at 6 times the rate of girls in that same age category, 15 to 24. And part of my book is going to be trying to find a reasonable explanation for why boys are committing suicide. Feminists, in keeping with their policy of demonizing men so that they can retain their sexual power over men, claim that, well, it's male toxicity that is causing boys and men to commit suicide at far higher rates than girls and women, putting the blame on the victim. If you look at it through the lens of someone who has taken the red pill, there's another reason why boys are committing suicide at 6 times the rate of girls. That age group is the age group that has the highest concentration of contact with our institutions, secondary schools, colleges, universities, the military, corporate entry-level jobs, etc. And our institutions, because of the immense brainwashing over the last 50 years conducted by the media and government and universities to demonize men, are saturated with hatred of men. They are saturated with the impulse to demonize boys and men. If you take a look at the people who give us an insight into why men and boys are committing suicide, it's because our society has made it clear that they hate them, they don't want them, they're simply disposable. They should fulfill their disposable roles to society and women, and otherwise get out, sit down, and be quiet. So that's kind of what the red pill is, and seeing things in different ways. Instead of seeing men as victims of their own toxic masculinity, seeing them as actually victims of unfair oppression of men that has occurred for at least 50 years.
You know, one of you probably heard of him, Dr. Warren Farrell. He's done quite a number of studies, and one of the studies he did was he was looking at suicide for boys relative to girls. So he was looking at it with an age group. So from, I think, like it was 9 to 15, 15 to 20, 20 to 25. And I may have those groups confused, but essentially what he was saying was that the rate of suicide between boys and girls from, I think it was 10 to 15 was slightly on par, mostly on par. The boys were slightly higher. From 15 to 20, I think the boys would suicide twice as often as the girls. By the time that you got to about 25, if I got this correctly, boys were committing suicide at 6 times the rate of girls. The number just spikes as they go through that period where they transition from being adolescents and teens into becoming men. And I think one of the theories that he puts forward is that we have an expectation that for women, they have a choice of different roles. They can work full time, they can stay at home full time, they can do any combination of the two, a little bit of each. And all are considered socially acceptable. No one has any issue or argument against it. It's fine. For boys, however, the roles that they're expected to play, the role that men are expected to play, hasn't changed in 1,000 years. You're still expected to work full time. You're still expected to put your life at risk to to protect your family. And as boys transition from being children, where they're cared for equally as the way girls are cared for, to becoming disposable, that transition is very hard for them to accept. To accept the fact that I was once your treasured, a child, and your prize, and you love me and everything, and I was on the pedestal, and now I'm disposable. I think that, and that's my interpretation. Is that transition is one that a lot of boys have a lot of difficulty making, and subsequently that leads to depression, and in many cases leads to suicide. Is that a stretch?
If that's Warren's insights, I think that's valid. But I think that's a small part of what's actually happening. What we're finding is that men and boys are committing suicide not just because of one particular thought or idea, but because they are finding themselves in a situation where there is no hope and no way out. And that's particularly true in our current culture and economy. For instance, a lot of criticism has been directed toward millennials for checking out of the workforce. Something like 40 to 60% of younger men are simply not working and have no intention of doing so. They're demonized as being lazy characters who hang around their mother's basement playing video games. Well, they may be living in their mother's basement and they may be playing video games, but it's not their fault. Our current economy and our current value of men in the labor force is so poor right now that these young men cannot afford to get involved in the labor market. They don't have a chance of ever making enough money to be able to pay for the costs of clothing and a car and transportation expense and insurance and all the things that are necessary just to have a job, because our economy isn't paying enough. So it's not really their fault. And that's when a man, for instance, has a family and he's stripped of his children and his life savings by very, very unfair divorce courts. And male judges are the worst for this.
Yeah.
Ruining a man because they have a daughter is what a lot of the research says.
Yeah.
That the man finds himself in a situation where there is literally no way out, no hope. It's not just a feeling that if he talks about it, he's going to get better. He's literally in a circumstance where, especially if he's middle-aged, he has no chance of starting a new career, of getting any of his life back. And he's alone, isolated, and it is a deliberate effect that our institutions impose on men because our institutions consider them to be disposable.
I've done a couple of shows in the last few months about paternity fraud, where, to your point, men are absolutely decimated in these courts. They do not, this is in the U.S., of course, they are not afforded due process. Having DNA evidence is not sufficient to prevent you from having your wages garnished at upwards of 55% after tax or more. Many of these guys are homeless. I had one gentleman who I interviewed who, after coming out of and serving 18 months in jail, he has 4 children to support, was hit with a paternity fraud case from a woman who his DNA evidence proved he had no relationship with this woman as far as having children. And he's still on the hook. He had paid her, I think, over $30,000 in child support. He can barely keep a roof over his head. He can barely feed his own children. And the child he's supporting has a better medical insurance plan than his own children have. And there's no way for him to get out of this. So that's just another one of these examples of the legal system absolutely decimating men. And to your point, you made it very clear, a lot of these judges are male judges.
If you enjoyed the show and want to see more, join our Facebook page called The Man Cave by Gentlemen United. All of our shows, tons of additional content, and invitations to future shows are posted there. You can add to the conversation and suggest future discussion topics. Please like, comment, share, and most of all, subscribe by clicking the Gentlemen United icon. I promise it's free. Thanks again for joining us in The Man Cave.
Enjoyed the show? Like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for joining us in The Man Cave.